Hey guys, this is Dave with Valor Fire Training, and in this episode of Q&A, we have Jay Bonnifield from Everett, Washington Fire Department. You've been there for about 6 years, right?
Yep.
Very cool. And he's a backstep fireman. He started in his fire service career in 2008. And I contacted Jay because a lot of the stuff that I've seen on social media, I got to be honest, as I'm flipping through, usually in the bathroom, I'm flipping through Facebook, and I run across this video of like super awesome fire conditions, and I'm like, oh, that's a cool video, and they're almost always yours, and it's just like the training environments that you're putting out there is really really cool, and I love what you're doing. But this question that I got from a guy named Tim was very specific to something that I think you're passionate about. And so Tim asks, I work for a suburban fire department, and during a recent training, we wanted to have more realistic fire conditions. Our training officer would not allow us to burn anything more than a pellet or two. We had light smoke conditions, high heat, and a decent amount of fire. I don't feel like this is a good representation of what we will see in the field, and I don't understand why we continue to train like this. What are your thoughts and feelings on having more realistic fire conditions for training in the fire service? And, from Valor Fire Training, doing the Fire for Effect class, where we actually talk about how to recreate those realistic environments, to your training, I think that it's something that is not really talked about a lot in the fire service right now. So what are your thoughts? What's your take on this?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's just so much so much to unpack in that question. There's just a ton of different layers to it, right? Um, I so one of the overall principles as a like when you're teaching live fire with anything, one of the overall principles that a guy that was one of my early mentors, Captain John Tanaka, he retired out of Everett Fire, and I got to work for him, and right before he retired, so I learned a lot from JT, as we call him. And one of the things that he said right early on in my journey of kind of teaching this stuff was, um, uh, when you're instructing this stuff, don't try to don't try to play imagine what I'm imagining or something like that. Like, just call it like you see it as it's happening. So it allows you a little bit more in an environment like that with say a less than ideal fuel load and less than ideal conditions. Like, there are little things that you can take out of it, intake, movement, exhaust, and so there's little things that you can take out of that, and you can make them teachable moments as they're occurring. I think a trap that a lot of guys will get into a little bit is they'll start trying to say, well, if this was a real fire, then it would be boom, 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 boom. And then instantly you kind of lost credibility with your students at that point.
Yeah,
So avoiding saying stuff like that, I think there's a difference. What they're trying to do, and I've done this as an instructor before, so it's not like I haven't been there and done that and watched the glaze over in the students' eyes when you say that. But the intention is like, hey guys, this isn't the full meal deal. That's what you're trying to convey. So I think the way to say that is, hey, we're gonna take this prop that we're using, or this whatever you're teaching in, and we're gonna provide context where the different little pieces of it do apply to the real world, and then the rest of it we can kind of kick along and we can
sure.
disregard. But yeah, I mean, whatever you're teaching in, it's important that you provide proper context. Like, we burn a lot in Connex box burn facilities and acquired structures, and I think they each have their place, provided proper context and pointing that out beforehand. Like, I'm not going to go into a Connex box burn and point out and say, hey, this is exactly like real world, to 100%, because it's not. I can get a lot of things close, but I can't get it 100%.
Right. Well, and I think too, and I was just having this discussion with somebody the other day because the topic came up of different environments that you can train in. And, whether you're building your own, burn container, which for those of you that don't know out there, it's considered a burn prop. It's not a burn building because then it falls under a whole nother NFPA rule. But if you build a burn prop with 4 walls and a roof and a door and a couple windows, and you're burning in it, that's one thing. If you're burning in a Connex box, that's a completely different environment. And where this conversation kind of went to was we were actually talking about simulation training and virtual reality. And they're like, oh, I bet you hate that. And I'm like, actually, I don't. Like, I really like the idea of the crawl, walk, run, sprint concept. And, if I'm going to take a new firefighter and put them into an SCBA mask, having the ability to put them into an environment virtually to see how they're going to react, I'd rather have that than have it be the first time they go into an actual fire. You know what I mean? But on the same token, I don't want a seasoned firefighter who's been through it 1,000 times going in and putting out a 2 pallet and straw fire all the time, because it just gets repetitive and it just gets boring for them. And there's nothing really that they get to see.
Well, and yeah, you gotta also take into account that more than likely that senior firefighter is looking to base future decisions off of whatever they're training in. And that's something that has plagued our area a little bit, because we in Western Washington here, Washington in general, but especially Western Washington, we've had for a long time the Washington State Fire Academy. And Washington State Fire Academy, I went through the State Fire Academy in 2011, and I mean, you burn like crazy up there, and it's this big concrete tower, and you're burning pallets and OSB, and it's just like you're just burning constantly for what is it, 12 weeks or something. I mean, it's nuts how much we get to burn up there. Now, a lot of funky tactics came out of that because it wasn't kept in proper context of, hey, the ceiling doesn't burn, the walls don't burn, you cannot get this thing to flash over, the floor will not burn off gas, and right. So you're dealing with contents fire after contents fire, and you're dealing with thick concrete walls that over the course of the day are just they're getting hot, and then like when you're going through with your stream and you're applying water, guys are like, oh, we were really concerned in our area with steaming victims out, right? And that was something that was like paramount concern. Well, it was because most people in this area were getting trained in this massive concrete oven where you can't cool it off with an 1 3/4 stream. You can put out the contents, but it's a contents fire with some gases that are burning that you're fighting back. And then if you apply too much water, you get a bunch of just nasty humidity all over the place. Well, it turns out real buildings aren't like that.
Right. Real buildings don't do that.
Yeah. So the proper context wasn't placed in. And I think for the instructors, it's kind of like you got to put your ego aside a little bit. And it's, maybe from an ego perspective, the instructor doesn't want to admit, hey, this isn't the real deal, Right. But like I said, there's a way to do that without, you don't have to say that, this is make believe land, this is all garbage. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. This is a contents fire. The building doesn't burn. So let's take it for what it's worth, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, you brought up a couple really good nuggets that I wanted to kind of circle back to. So, when you talk about the environment and as instructors, how we deal with things. I mean, I've been guilty of it too. We get the fire going, it's really stoked up and it's got good rollover. And so we want to keep that going for each group, but they're never getting the experience of actually putting the fire out and going in and doing overhaul and doing stuff like that. And so, like one of the things here that we started doing within our trainings is that we would take the pallets and we would put sheetrock around them. So we'd make like a box out of pallets, we'd sheetrock it. And then we'd do little things like we would hang up a piece of paper with some duct tape on the wall, maybe halfway up. And this is either in a Connex or a concrete building. And we even put them like above the doorway behind you as you come into a room. And so as you're coming into that room, if you time it just right, and if you kind of control it where you need to, you'll have that piece of paper catch on fire behind them. And so they're getting that context of, hey, when I come through a doorway, I need to turn around and check behind me. Or I'm watching the thermal layer and all of a sudden that piece of paper starts to off gas and then it starts on fire. So it's giving them those visual cues while still not having a realistic environment.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and so that's like, so for us, myself and a bunch of the guys that I teach with at our fire, we've got a county fire training academy. So we kind of pulled all of our recruits in our county away from the state fire academy, and we were essentially given free reign, like, hey, build build your dream engine side of the academy. Live fire, engine company skills. I teach on the engine side with guy named Brendan Grace, Derek Roberts, Jeremy Carapostles, Ryan Hopp, these guys. So we all got together and essentially we're given free reign, like, hey, don't worry about checklists, don't worry about, skill sheets, just like make it how you want it. And
so
it was like,
so what you're saying is they don't want you to teach to the book.
Yeah. Yeah. And so our philosophy essentially from a recruit training perspective is we're going to train these guys and gals so robustly the way that we want them trained, that when the state proctor comes in to give them their test, if they just do everything how we taught them to do it, they don't ever need to even look at a task sheet. They're going to kill it. And we're now at like, yeah, it's been 4 years, I think, and we're doing 2 to 3 classes of 30 to 40 a year. So I however many, a couple hundred, few hundred recruits that have come through, and we've never had a problem with somebody failing, when they get to that point. And I think it's a good, I always try to pass that along, because a lot of some of the live fire stuff that comes out as well, we have to teach to this skill sheet and to this skill sheet. And I don't want to say blanketly like everybody's area is the same, but I think that sometimes there's an impression that you have to teach to these skill sheets. And if you take, in my experience, if you take the stance of, hey, I'm going to teach this, I'm going to be aware as the instructor of what the skill sheets want.
Right.
I'm going to make sure that my curriculum covers that stuff, but I want to cover it the way that I want it covered. And then they're going to go out there and they're going to crush it, and without having to sit there and study these, point by point skill sheets. And, we ended up using Connex box burn facilities, and then also acquired structures. And we use them to teach a progression, is kind of how we look at it. We're working up there's things in the Connex box. So in the Connex box world, we use this load. We go basically 3 to 4 pallets and then a bunch of hay. And then we use each load, we use anywhere between like 4 to 6 sheets of OSB. And I mean, it's expensive, like, especially now, OSB is like $30 a sheet. So, it's a big commitment from the departments. But the deal is that we've really dialed in fuel package wise for live fire. Here's what we want to teach. We want to teach a spectrum of fuel controlled fires that are cleaner burning, and then all the way to the snotty choke down ventilation limited, which in order to do that, you just need a lot of OSB.
Yeah.
Right. So, and in that we're teaching contents fires, and we can play around with ventilation profiles. And the nice thing that Connex boxes have is there's just this repeatability to them. We can burn 40 times in a day. Essentially, it becomes just how good are your logistics, reloading and getting everything pulled out, right? But in acquired structure, you can't do that. We target in acquired structure typically 8 burns a day. So we're slowing way down on that. But there's so much more value in how you do the acquired structure. There's so much value in a different area, right?
Right. Well, and in the acquired structure, and we were talking off camera before this about your experience and my experience coming into the fire service. I mean, I fought, and as wrong as this probably is now, it wasn't wrong back in the day. But I grew up fighting fires in concrete burn buildings with couches and mattresses and tires and just stuff that was ungodly that we should have never been probably burning. But when I came out of the fire academy, we did a lot of acquired structures. And so, very early on, I had soft burned out floors where if I would have not been sounding, I would have gone through a hole. And so I learned all that stuff really quickly. But I think, like with your fuel packages, it gives you the ability to really dial it in. And I love that. So, how do you, because this is a question that I get a lot when we're teaching our class or when we're out there doing other trainings, how do you deal with the fear mongers? Because there's a lot of people out there, and I think what Tim's question specifically was getting at is, it sounds like this training officer is like, this is what NFPA says, we cannot go one step past that. And so I've had to sit there and argue with people of
Yeah.
like, it is OSB allowed, or is
Mhm.
this certain fuel package allowed? So what's your thought on that? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny, so like NFPA as a whole, especially when it comes to the acquired structure realm, like 1403, and when you get into acquired structures, you get very a very broad spectrum of like training officer opinions on what some are okay with and what some are not. So from my standpoint, like as a firefighter who is, instructing this stuff, I think it's important for me, and what I would advocate, to this guy asking the question is, what what we have to understand from our level is they have to have trust in us that we're not going to hurt somebody. And a lot of what I hear when I hear a training officer say that is, even if you're good buddies, at the end of the day, it's kind of him that's on the line,
Right.
right? And nobody wants to get anybody hurt, so if he has this kind of level of, it starts with trust. If he has this level of doubt that maybe you're just trying to go big for the sake of going big, then nothing is going to change productively until you get through that. So start with earning their trust and showing them, hey, I want to show a spectrum, and I have this well thought out, well researched progression that I want to show these guys. I want to show them pump can fires. We'll start small, pump can fires, contents fires. I want to show them intake and exhaust exchanges so that we can, like I reference Scott Corrigan sometimes. Scott just did a webcast yesterday that was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And one of his big things that I just love is they teach their new people hunt for intakes and pull triggers. Like you go, if you can identify an intake and an exhaust, hunt for the intake, and then that's your road to glory there as far as your fire attack goes. So hunt for intakes. Like I want to teach that to recruits, and then I want to teach them going up the spectrum. I want to show them seat flame, and I want to show them gas flame coming off of that seat flame. In order to do that, you have to increase your fuel load. You have to add that OSB because pallets just burn way too clean.
Right.
And so there's a difference between the two of those. So if as you walk them through the progression, and you're building trust because he sees you have a plan and there's a method, there's a reason behind the madness there. It's not just go big for going big sake. And I always take the stance like, hey, if one of our recruits, so I'm always between them and the fire. Like if somebody's going to get hot first, it's me. That way I'm the the canary, right? I don't want anybody back behind me melting a shield or bubbling a helmet or something like that. Like if that happens, then it's probably because I didn't do something right.
Sure.
So you got to build that trust with them, and then I think it's valuable to just like reach outside. Like if you're at kind of an impasse and you feel like stuff's just not moving, reach outside, and bring in like a third party that's unrelated, just if nothing else over the phone, that training chief can kind of hear, and they're going to say a lot of the same stuff that you're saying, but just the fact that it's coming from somebody different,
Yeah.
sometimes it makes all that makes the difference for them.
Absolutely, it does. Well, it's funny that you bring that up. So, one of my experiences that I've had, and I had not actually had this experience before. We were teaching at the Oklahoma State Fire School, and I know that the people that were involved in this story are okay with me talking about it because we were all able to laugh about it afterwards. But we were going to do search under live fire, And when we were setting everything up, the chief of training and a bunch of other training officers came out and they're like, "Hey man, we're shutting you down." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" They're like, "You cannot under any circumstance do live fire and search at the same time. Like we won't allow for that." And I was like, "Okay." I was like, "Well, I mean, it's your training center, so
Right.
you know, let's can we talk about this?" And they're like, "Well, yeah, let's talk about it. You know, this is what we think you're doing." And what they thought we were doing and what we were actually going to do was two completely different things. And
Yes.
so when we started talking to them, I said, when we start out, we're going to start out with a fog machine and they're going to run through the scenarios and they're going to get comfortable searching in low visibility. They're going to have a simulated fire with a flashlight as the fire. And so they're going to have to attack that and they're going to have to do all those things. Then we're going to move up to burn pods so that it's more of like a room and contents fire, you know, maybe like a trash can or a trash can and a desk type fire. And then we're going to move our way up to a whole room where they have to crawl down a hallway. And once we explained it to them like that, they were a little bit more open to it, but they were still really cautious until we said, "Well, why don't we do this? Why don't you have some of your instructors and your training staff in there with our instructors? That way you guys can monitor it. And if you see something that you don't like, we can just change it or stop it altogether right then and there." And I'll never forget this. One of the training officers who was really, really, really overbearing and like super, like I was terrified of this guy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're sitting in this hallway and I'm chilling and I'm watching this fire kind of roll over our head. And he comes around the corner and crawls down the hallway and he's like, "Man, this is awesome. This is so cool." And so
Yeah.
they loved it. And but again, it was crawl, walk, run. You know, we weren't
Yeah.
just saying, "Hey, we're going to light a fire until there's stuff blowing out the windows and we're going to have them vent or search through the flames." Like it wasn't. And I think that's what goes through every instructor's mind when they hear something like that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I get it. I mean, so the group West Coast Fire Training that we do all these acquired structure burns with, my buddy Ian, who's a lieutenant with Seattle here, he has a very good like system as far as you know, we need one of our guys on the safety line and we need like, so we've got this whole system built, and really the intent behind it is it's a couple full, but one of them is because it keeps everybody safe and there's a game plan and everything always goes better, especially in live fire. The more you know, from Connex boxes and acquired structures like Connex boxes, it's a logistic thing. The logistics drive the training. How efficiently can we put everything out? And like I'm a firm believer that when you're teaching fire attack and these things, like put the stuff out. As an instructor, it causes more work for you, but the whole like, hey, you know, leave some fire going, that whole thing, like, man, just you're that's pretty well known. It's a training scar.
Yeah.
So you know, hey man, go in there, crush it, and then I'll pull stuff out. It's not that much extra work. It adds up over the day. But if we get our logistics dialed in on Connex boxes, we can pull the stuff out, we can reset it, we can get everything ready to go again while the instructor of the attack line is debriefing the students. You know, you just have to understand how that progression is going to go to maximize, you know, turn and burn and get you know, students through. And then in acquired structures, it's a little bit more of a dynamic environment because the walls burn, the ceiling burn, the floor burn. You can flash that room over. You can. So in that instance, it helps to have this like robust game plan of here's how the rotation goes and here's where everybody's sitting. And I want to, you know, we have an instructor on the attack line. We have an instructor always at a minimum, preferably two of our guys on the safety line, because I don't want to mess around. I don't put, you know, in a acquired structure, I don't put a student on the safety line because I don't know how they're going to react. And you can have some, and we have had some fairly close calls, which because we have the safety line there, I hesitate to even call them close calls because that's what it's there for. It was like, hey man, it behaved a little bit faster. It was a little bit more aggressive than we thought. We ended up getting our timing off. Safety line had to put it out.
Yeah.
There's still value there for people to learn from, but that's why it's there. A big part of the reason why Ian put this structure together is to comfort the training officer. because when we're there, like they understand it's them. They're the one on the docket. Like if something goes wrong, they're, public enemy number one. And I respect that. I'm not a training officer. I'm a firefighter and I teach this stuff, but ultimately I have to, look at them and go, okay, put myself in their shoes. It's a big deal. And heavy is the crown, so to speak. So if I can make them feel really comfortable and then invite them in, like you're saying, and usually though, if they come in, it's like, oh, this is awesome. And then they're just like loosey goosey having fun the rest of the day, because they see we're good. We got this.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, and again, every building is dynamic. Every building is different, but, I really like having, and maybe not a training officer aspect, but like to run a fire training company and to actually go and do live fire, there's always that little thing in the back of your head. Like, is this going to be the one training that somebody gets hurt and I'm going to end up getting screwed over, but we do. I mean, we'll put somebody at every turn. We'll put somebody at every staircase. We put, and we just did a fire training up in Nebraska, and it was really, really cool to see the dynamics of this burn container where it was a long 40-foot container. And at the end of the 40 feet opposite of the burn room, they had a staircase. Well, we were able to recreate basement fires to where fire was actually going up that stairwell.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is that you actually had to fight it back down the stairs and come in from what would have been the first floor, kind of simulated.
Right.
But I had guys from the cadre standing at the top of the stairwell, kneeling at the top of the stairs, and they're calling out temps like, hey, we're at 150. Hey, we're at 175. Hey, we're at 250. And then I'm coordinating with the backup line guys. And I'm like, hey, just give it like a 3-second hit. And so we're just kind of, but again, there are so many times growing up in the fire service where that didn't happen. And I know why the NFPA rules are there, because I saw stupid stuff happen. I saw people get burned. And I got burned. I mean, I've talked about it in a lot of the lectures that I've done where, you get the pinpricks, you get the bubbles on your ears. That wasn't not uncommon. So where do you think we are right now with our training theories, and where do you think we need to be?
So I think, I was talking about context. I think that is one of the more important battles as far as live fire training can go, to put the proper context in some of these buildings. Like, so for, concrete burn facilities, being able to clearly identify, here's the things you can teach in a concrete burn facility. Intake and exhaust exchange, ventilation ratios you can teach, but then when it comes to the fire attack side, the fire attack side is pretty limited in concrete burn buildings because of how like exothermic everything remains. There's just so much ambient heat in there and so much humidity. So it gives it kind of an unrealistic actual fire attack, right? But as far as playing with fire behavior, you can play with fire behavior and get some, essentially like fluid dynamics of how that smoke and that fire is going, and the pressure, creating negative pressures. You can do that in those buildings, and it's valuable. Well, then you go to, Connex boxes, and it's kind of the same thing, except for now with a Connex box, your fire attack becomes a little bit more, a little bit more teachable, under the caveat that it's going to still produce a lot more humidity, just because it's a metal box, right? And we've played around with like lining the box with OSB and all that kind of stuff. And you can put in quite a bit of work in those things to get them to behave very similarly. I won't say 100%, but very similarly to a real building. Now, some of the limitations there are layouts are dissimilar, doorways, all that kind of stuff. So you're still not 100%, but you're getting closer. And then the acquired structures, where it's a real building, it's a real fire in a real building, definitely, still using the pallets. It's like staying within 1403 and using pallets and OSB, which are doable under 1403. But then, going for, instead of this massive volume of burns, which initially my acquired structure experience was a bunch of little campfires in a corner, and you try to get, when I was a volunteer part-time guy, but, it was like everybody's got to get through there, and everybody's going in with an 1.75 line on a, a pump can fire that if you, cried too hard, you'd put it out, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not using that facility for its potential in context, right? It's a mismatch there. So the acquired structure, yeah, hey, we're going to get 8 burns today out of this thing, but every single one of those is going to be a room that was a 1-room fire that was driven to flashover, that was extending beyond the compartment. So that way, when our fire tech goes in, we're teaching hit and move and push, or flowing while moving. Everybody sees the benefits of either or attack in the right context and how the building actually behaves to it, because more often than not, people will go in like a Connex box or a concrete bird, and a guy will be like, hey man, we really need to get flowing and moving, we need to be doing this. Okay, let's go test it out in the burn building. They go into a metal box and they push a metal box and they flow a bunch of water, and it just generates all this humidity, right?
Yeah.
And the guys who are kind of like on the fence about it, like no, that's not, because it's not in the proper context. That doesn't happen in a real building, right? But then you go in a real building and you see, like UL talks about, the gas contraction taking place, and the overwhelming of the flow path, the intake that draws behind you, and all the lift that's provided, even against no vent on the backside. Like, you can teach that in an acquired structure. So I think that's when we clearly define and we clearly articulate the limitations and the proper teaching methodologies in these facilities, then it makes it a little bit easier from a training officer's perspective and stuff, to be able to, break this facility apart, and how do we get this out of this facility, right? Take an acquired structure for an example. A training officer won't be as inclined to say, hey, it's going to be 2 pallets and some hay and nothing more. You're like, well, then how are we going to teach what we're supposed to teach in here? Right? Because in order to teach that, we have to build this a certain way. We have to have a certain amount of fuel and certain type of fuel with OSB and so on and so forth. I think it makes it a little bit easier at that point. You can't really argue it. Just, you have to get what you have to get to teach that out of that structure. And I think something else that would probably help as well is a little bit more delineation. This is something Ian and I have talked a lot about, and something that I think Ian is really, I think he's onto something here with. Just because you can teach live fire, like, all live fire instructors aren't necessarily at that same point where they should necessarily be teaching everything, right? It's been a progression for me, getting from, going from loading pallets and watching guys teach in concrete buildings, and then you kind of work up that scale. Like, in an acquired structure burn, there's just so much more that can go wrong with that if you're teaching it, and maximizing that building. So, maybe having, like Ian's talked about, a tiered system where, hey, you've been teaching you're checked off to teaching, these kind of structures, and you're able to help or maybe teach a station in these kind of structures, but you can't lead the whole burn.
Right.
I think that would go a long way to fostering a safer live fire atmosphere, which is, we should all want that. We should all want nobody to get hurt in these things, but we should also all want to be able to maximize the full depth and breadth of what we can possibly do for live fire training, because it's one of the most valuable things we do, if not the most valuable. So, and the two don't have to be opposed. We don't have to have safety or realism, right?
You can have both. You can do it.
Yeah, we should have both. Absolutely. They shouldn't be in opposition to each other. And no, man, we should have safety. We're not bubbling helmets and all that kind of stuff. We're teaching live fire as much as we possibly can, as real as we can, and it's safe, right? That's what we're going for.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has always driven me nuts, going from, starting, because I started in the fire service in 1994. So, moving from moving from the ability to burn in a building, and I'm not saying that the burning couches and chairs and stuff like that was stupid, and we'd already talked about that. But
Yeah.
as we move forward, there are so many times where, as an academy instructor for a community college, we go to a local fire department. We burn in their burn building that has the tiles. They don't want us to use a smooth bore. It's got to be a fog. We can't go
Yep.
over 95 gallons a minute. They only want 2 pallets with like a little bit of straw. And then the same type of training will get replicated in other places. And the training officers are like, hey, we can't do this because it's not safe.
Right.
But then they'll turn around and they'll completely furnish the entire room that we were just in a week ago for a uh, arson investigation class. And they'll light off, a couple tables, couches, chairs, TVs, all this other stuff. And
Right.
I'm like, so how do you guys put that out? And they're like, well, we send somebody in and then they just kind of like sit at the door and just like hit it from the hallway. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So when we look,
Yeah. Well, and that's like one of my biggest, pet peeves is a lot of a lot of the angst, and I think that like you're talking about, is because there's an impression with live fire training that you have to get as close as you can, and you have to, belly into the thing and take a beating and get as close as you can to see the cool stuff so that you can, put it out and whatnot. And so everybody kind of like just instinctually knows, you're going to take a beating doing that. And like, do I trust this guy that I don't know very well, that I'm on the hook for, to like lead all these people who don't know what they're doing,
right.
and beat them up, but not hurt anybody? Like, it doesn't have to be that way, man. Like, what we should be teaching is stream reach,
Yeah.
and that's something a lot of live fire instructors, just like that I have experienced in the past, especially, they weren't teaching stream reach because they wanted you to see the cool stuff. They're like, look at this fire that I'm building for you. Like,
Right. I have
it's
made
cool.
fire.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I made fire. Like, what, like I want you to appreciate it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're unintentionally teaching is you have to get as close as you can to this thing to open up on it. And then they'll go out and they'll tell everybody, hey, we don't do that. We don't do that. When I was young, they taught me I had to belly in as close as I can, and that's not how we do it. But then they go and teach that.
Right.
Like, ugh. Like, no, man, let's utilize the stream reach. So a guy like that who, oh yeah, we put it out from the door. You're like, yeah, that's what I was gonna do.
Right. Exactly. Well,
Same thing.
And what I love doing, and it doesn't matter whether it's in an acquired structure. It's a little bit easier, I think, to do in a manufactured training facility. But one of the things that I love doing in the way that we structure our classes when we're doing engine company is we'll start out with a couple pallets and some straw to get a really clean burning fire, but you still have that heat so that they can see steam conversion. And they can visually see, like, as soon as I turn the corner and I start opening up that line, you can see the thermal imbalance and you can see the fire start getting blackened down. And then we move up to maybe like 1 or 2 pieces of OSB to where they get a little bit more smoke. It's maybe a little hazier, but they can still see where the base of the fire is. And then by the end of the day, I mean, I won't bore you with the whole progression, but by the end of the day, we're slapping 4, 5, 6 sheets of plywood or OSB. And we even have runners coming down the hall so that as it's burning down the hall, you kind of get that fire blast effect.
Yep.
And so they really truly can't see where the seat of the fire is, but they can hear it and they can feel it. And so you get to see these students, and I love the fact that you do a lot of video recording with your ticks, because I hope to be able to do that at some point. But
It's a low budget operation. Ticks and old cell phones were like this.
Yeah. Well, and I can't find anybody that wants to risk their cell phone to be able to do it.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's so cool because as the instructor, I'm sitting there watching these students come down the hall with the tick, and they will turn that corner, and before they even make the fire room, they're already opening it up and they're already flowing into that fire room. And then they shut it down. They call for ventilation. They let the smoke come up. And then you can see them looking underneath the smoke, and they're like, okay, that's where we need to go to put the rest of the fire out. And it's like a proud papa moment,
Right. Yeah, and that like the progression. I mean, it does me, it does my heart well to like hear. Yeah, that's a progression. That's how we should be teaching it. And working like we uh if your recruits or your whatever your students, you're teaching live fire and they leave and they don't understand that you can have zero visibility, high heat, snap, crackle, pop, and that's a problem. Like that's a big deal. And not that we need to be like completely scared, but like we need to solve that problem,
Yeah.
right? And if we're not teaching to that point, like if we're building all of our fires just to be this clean burning, we talk a lot about the separation between you've got your seat fire, they call it plume flame back in the day. But you've got your seat flame, which is more, it's cleaner burning. It's more, it's the room that's on fire. Like sometimes the seat's a couch, sometimes it is the couch and the wall and the ceiling, and sometimes it is the whole room. But either way, it's more complete combustion, and so it's going to be cleaner burning. It's going to be more intense. That seat fire does not go out until water gets on the seat.
Yep.
Right? You can sit there in the hallway and dump a million gallons of water down the hallway, but until your stream gets in the room, it's not going out. So being able to differentiate that between everybody gets like fascinated by the rollover. Well, like what is rollover? Because you've got your seat flame that's going to hit the ceiling and start bending towards low pressure, and then you have this volume of smoke that's filling the box, and the heat's taking the shape of the box, and then you get this like dirtier looking flame that a lot of times you can, with OSB and stuff, you can get it like really snotty looking. And then beyond that, it's just a bunch of really hot turbulent smoke. Like I want to show them that progression, because it's important that when they leave this class that they understand, hey man, you're in a box that's filled with a bunch of smoke, and that smoke is like toss and turn and chunky black nasty marshmallows. Stuff is hot. So
Yeah.
here's a tick. Here's how I'm going to show you. Oh, boom, there you go. It's 800 degrees at the ceiling. Like that's a problem. So let's cool this thing down instead of just continuing to go for the glow, right? Because a lot of times that live fire training done wrong just kind of teaches go for the glow, and
Right.
they go until they see the glow, and then they open like no 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 no, let's not do that.
Well,
So
yeah, and going back to that context thing that you said, and it made me think of it when you mentioned it. So like the Fire Blast, and I have nothing against Fire Blast. I think it's a great product. I think it does really well for what it's intended to. But I know for a fact that in the fire service, that's where we went wrong, is that you had this Fire Blast system that was shooting gas down the hallway, and people called that, streamers. But it's not streamers. That's not hot gas that's igniting because there's the right mixture of air and fuel. That's more indicative of like what you would see with rollover from the seat of the fire. And
right.
so people equated that to, newer students that didn't know any better. They see that fire rolling up and across the ceiling and they're like, okay, that's the streamers. Well, then they get in the hallway and they see that. And so I've seen students start opening up the line and hitting it, thinking that they were hitting the fire. And I'm like,
Yeah.
no, dude, all you're doing is cooling down the environment. And they're like, oh, yeah, I guess I never knew that. Well, it's because we misidentified. And I almost guarantee you with your statement, I think you're 100% dead on. Somebody somewhere was like, well, in a real fire, that wouldn't be this. But just imagine
Yes.
that it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're going to teach live fire, like you have to also, I think, understand, or at least like at a base level, understand, how people learn and how patterns are formed, right? Because, when you're teaching somebody in a live fire environment, you are programming it like a very, especially if they're brand new. If they're brand new, it's 100%. If they're more experienced, like it becomes less and less, but you're still capable of programming like these very basic, like primal reactions to stressors,
Yes.
right? And the newer they are, the more you're doing that. So if you are teaching something without context, you're bumbling along blissfully unaware that what you're actually doing is you are instilling a primal reaction that person, when they encounter something in the field, their brain is going to search through the slides in the slideshow super quick to find the closest pattern match, and then boom, that's the one they're going to go with, right? And if you're not careful and you don't provide the proper context of and by providing proper context, I think, going back to like what I was saying at first is teach what you see, like tell them what you're seeing. Don't say, here's in a real fire, we're going to blah, 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 because what they're seeing is going to be a pattern match for something.
Right.
So provide them the actual pattern match that it is. Like, hey, you're seeing right now rollover, and what we're seeing is like it's this dirty kind of smoke that's burning. Like, see how it's darker than the stuff down the hallway that's a lot cleaner burning? Like, that's seat flame, this is gas flame right here. Like, ignore going into all the details in a real structure fire. If you're in like a Conex box or something that would make a real structure fire different, just teach the couple of points that are legitimate, that you can draw out of there. And that way those pattern matches become proper pattern matches in context, and not paint. They're not going to take them and paint with this broad brush and then essentially like searching for the glow later on because they have to get to this point. Like, you just don't do that. You've gone too far. If you're going into this thing and you're like, oh yeah, in a real fire it's going to be like this, and we're going to do blah 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 blah. They're taking that pattern match and essentially going, okay, this is like a real fire, and then they're going to treat a real fire like that Connex box.
Yeah, and we've spoken several times about this in different respects, but I know you've probably had it, and I've had it as well, where we had a firefighter who came out and said the same thing that I've heard a lot of people say over the years. Man, it was really hot and I couldn't see a foot in front of my face, and I'm thinking, bro, it's a building on fire. Like, how did you not know that that's what you were going to see? And then I realized that that's not something that they'd ever seen. They'd only seen theatrical smoke. They'd only seen gas fires that go out like that. And
well, contextually, they were used to in the theater, the theatrical smoke and stuff. It was like they were pre-programmed. Smoke is just something to be crawled around in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So absolutely. Then, it makes sense. You backtrace, you're like, oh yeah, no wonder you would do that, right?
Well, and the other thing that I think is really kind of intriguing, and I've thought about this a lot over the years, is that, the people that taught us, right? Like, if you think back to your instructors that taught you, and if everybody watching thinks back to whoever taught them, we have a love for those people that it's not really found in a lot of other places. Now, I can tell you that during the courses that I went through for initial education, I hated my instructor. He was an asshole, and we butted heads. But he turned out to be one of the most caring, nurturing instructors who took time to explain everything. And I still talk to him to this day. So Darren Littner, if you're watching, I'm talking about you. But as we progress through, it's so hard as an instructor now to come back and challenge some of those theories that those people put out there, because it's almost like a drill instructor for the military. You don't talk bad about somebody's DI.
Yeah.
Because everything that they were taught by their DI is true, regardless of if it is or not. And so I think that's really tough moving forward now, where I'm like, no. You can't look at this situation like this because maybe you didn't learn it right. And they're like, well, but I learned it from so-and-so, and that guy's a good guy. And I'm like,
and that's ego, it's so tough. I think that's a fantastic observation. Cause like, Tanaka, my early mentor, like he had early mentors too, right? And he was like, hey, I took what this guy taught me, and then I kind of know through my learning progression, I was able to sit back, because like that guy who's doing the teaching, his head's in the trenches, and he's trying to make things as good as he can, dial them in, tweak them and stuff like that. But you have a different perspective when you're the student. And because that student is probably learning from other spheres of influence as well, and then you're like reconciling them back on this main sphere of influence. And then I did that with him, and he was pretty upfront about it. He's like, hey, take what you can from me. I'm not infallible. Make it better. Go learn from other people, all that kind of stuff. Just make sure that he had like some recommendations of like some core tenets to kind of always come back to. And you know, you have to be careful because there's so many voices in the fire service. Everybody has a voice, everybody wants a voice, all that kind of stuff. And you know, it's good and bad, right? You just have to be very careful with you know, understanding like firefighting to an extent is pretty regional.
Sure.
So like you got to be careful if you're going way outside of your region to like learn from this guy who may have some very like a lot of really valid stuff, but then if you try to like implement it in your region, just the two, because of whatever reason, aren't a super good fit. So like there's a lot of different layers to that, but at the end of the day, you know, strive for understanding how people learn is important. Have a respect as an instructor for the fact that you're you know, implementing these core reactions that people are going to have on real fires, and like don't take that responsibility lightly. And you know, just kind of always be a student and like, okay, boom, there you go forward and take what I've taught you and just make it better. So I think that there is, like you're saying, a little bit of this mindset, because there has been with me of, well, I don't want to contradict anything that guy said.
Right.
But if you ask that guy, he'd probably be like, dude, if I'm wrong, contradict me, please.
The good ones will. And that's the one thing, like Darren, when he was teaching us, and I mean, he said this almost 2 decades ago. If I teach you something today, in 10 years, it's not going to be valid. You need to continuously learn your job and your craft. And he said this in a class in front of all of us. Don't take what I teach you now and carry it for the rest of your career. It's going to change, and you need to be able to look at things open-mindedly. And I was like, oh, what the hell is this guy talking about? And fast forward to today, and I'm like, that's what he was talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Like, don't be the, you know, there's the two ends of the spectrum, you know, don't be the one that's never changing, but also don't be on the other end of the spectrum where you're like changing every time the wind shifts, you know, and you just kind of are always going through this evaluation of you know, how can I tweak it, make it better, and is there a little nugget I can pluck from over here and over here and over here that jive with what we're trying to do here. But yeah, I mean, the ego, as soon as the ego gets involved, it's like you're in trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
It's not
absolutely.
about building a legacy.
Well, and getting back to, Tim's original question about, the safety, or the training officer who was very safety minded, which I love. That's
Yeah,
I'm never going to fault somebody for being too safety conscious. Like, I'm sorry, if you want to have somebody be super safe, you're not going to go wrong.
yeah,
As far as not getting people hurt. Now, you can go wrong as far as the instruction and some of the other stuff, but I think with Tim's issue, going back to that training officer and saying, hey, I just watched this podcast or this video of these two guys talking. Why don't you take a listen? I think it's so important for us as the student to also understand that it's not always about having the best fire conditions and the most realistic fire conditions. I've done several scenarios where it didn't really go as planned, and it kind of turned into more of just like a trash can fire.
yeah,
But even that's a teachable moment. Like, hey, why'd you guys stretch a line? Well, because we always stretch a line. Well, could you have put this out with a water can? Yeah. Well, then next time, pull the water can. And sure enough, the next time it happened where our timing was off or something didn't work right, here comes the crew, crawling in with a
right,
water can. And they're like, man, that was great. Now we don't have to pick anything up. So
yeah,
it's,
yeah, and I think another thing too that can help them out a lot is, are you, so to break down, like, are you going for more of a multi-company operation type of a fire training? Are you going for like a skill isolation, right? Like
right.
last week we had a acquired structure we were burning for our recruits, and we picked, there was very specific skills. Now, we don't treat the acquired structures with the recruits like MCOs. Now, for a company level training, we might do more of an MCO style. The drawback to MCOs is that you have to have your timing right. Like, essentially, you're trying to get that company to arrive and give a report, and you're hoping that they're going to stretch their line and mask up, and they're going to do everything they need to do to go in and fight the fire. in a certain period of time so that you don't lose the room. Or
Right.
or in a Conex box, it's like you don't lose the fuel load, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of playing with timing, and then all of a sudden you get, B shift shows up, and you know that it's going to take them 5 minutes to get their masks on. You're like, it throws your whole timing off and everything else. So I would start with, just to build confidence, start with skill isolation, and say, hey, we're going to teach fire attack. Like we break it down between hit and move and flowing and moving. For us, hit and move is a contents fire, or you have a direct line of sight on the seat with your nozzle. Something in that realm there. So it's on the, as far as spectrum goes, it's a little bit lower on the spectrum, because we don't want to have guys hitting, shutting down, moving forward in zero vis, high heat,
Right.
fire blowing in their face, that sort of thing, right? And then we teach flowing while moving. Uh, uh, when we actually start to draw all of that heat, we try to get the hallway involved and all that kind of stuff. That's where we're going to teach flowing and moving. So there's a infinite amount of teaching that can go on there, but you're teaching one thing. So you bring the line in, you have them hold, you have the safety line sitting here, like if we're talking acquired structure setting, especially. But in Connex boxes, you got to have the safety line there too. But you can have the line hold, and you're like, hey, hold here. We're going to talk about some fire behavior stuff while I get this fire how I want it to be for you.
Yep.
I want it to look a certain way for a hit and move fire. I don't want it to be this massive, as much fire as I can give you. I want it to be in this window here. Here's why. Okay, now it's there. Go. You're not worried about timing. You're not going to screw it up. You have 2 inch and 3/4 lines there that are going to absolutely demolish this fire every day and twice on Sunday.
Yeah.
So safety wise, you're totally fine. And it just looks like to a training officer, it looks like a much more clean, professional, well run, and the students are happy because they're getting some, and everybody goes home happy on that. I think if you try to pull off like MCOs right out of the gate, and there's not a high level of trust between the two,
Yeah.
there's so much timing, and especially with your cadre, like it takes more than one guy to run an MCO or any live fire, but MCOs especially, everybody has to be on the same page. So I would start small and make sure that you're, like I said, between the student and the fire, maintaining that so that you're always aware of conditions and whatnot. And then maybe start by sending them a little bit earlier than you would probably think that you need to, until you start really getting confident with, because as an instructor, you have to be confident with the students. There's trust there too.
Yeah.
Shoot, man, we've had guys that we just took for granted in an open class. One time, it really pops into my mind, and this guy was just heart of gold, one of the greatest guys I've ever had the pleasure of training with. But we didn't realize that he had never worn an SCBA before. This was his first time, and we didn't have like a caveat of, hey, you need to come with certain level of experience. We just it was an open class. And he showed up, and he was in there, and he got claustrophobic in his mask and started trying to rip his mask off. And one of our instructors was heads up and yanked him out. But that was a big learning point. Like, there's trust there too.
Oh yeah.
So all the way through, when that whole operation looks very clean and professional and safe, the safety officer is the training officer is much more willing to look at the fuel load, and you're like, hey, I'm not getting what I need to teach this. Here's what I need. Can we do it? He's a lot more willing at that point to be like, yeah, okay, I see. Let's do it. Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, from an instructor standpoint, there are times I've gotten really comfortable depending on the situation. I mean, granted, I haven't been in like a 15-story high-rise fire training center, but I've been in 4, 5, 6, 7 stories. And especially with those or anything smaller than that, I feel like I'm pretty good at judging about where the temperatures are, with my hood, my gloves, and things like that. But there's little things that we take for granted. Like we had an instructor who changed his gloves to a different manufacturer. he had been with us for several years, and we usually take 6 or 7 instructors if we're going to do a decent sized live fire training.
Yep.
And so he was in the safety kind of zone. And so I had him like just double check, and I'm like, hey man, if it starts feeling kind of crispy, let me know. And he's like, all right, cool. Well, his way of doing that for the last several years is he'll put his hand up in the air and he'll kind of get a gauge for how hot it is, where the temperatures are. And what we took for granted was that he changed his gloves to a higher TPP.
Yep.
And didn't even think about it. And so he was putting his hand up there. He's like, nope, we're good. And he pulled his hand back down. And I saw him doing it every, couple minutes. He put his hand up. And I'm like, hey, man, we still good? He's like, yeah, dude, we're good. And then I crawled down the hall. I was like, oh my gosh. I was like, dude, it's really hot. There were tons of expletives, but he wasn't thinking about that. And so that was a huge learning experience for us that, had we put some students down that hallway, when they came in, they would have been walking and then they would have immediately dropped. I guarantee you we would have melted some shields.
Yeah, I had a very similar thing last week where I was the one that was blissfully unaware. I was at the front of the group, and we had a bedroom fire, and it was fresh OSB everywhere. There's probably 10 sheets of OSB that we reinforced this room with. I don't like in acquired structures, more often than not, I don't like using drywall because we let these things go to flash. We let them flash over. Right. And like mechanically, or flash over can't happen unless the floor is burning, right? So like you have to have the floor has to be able to burn. And so we'll put, the more OSB you use, the more volatile that room is. So like fresh rooms always give me a little bit of like angst.
You're like
yeah, and I told I was lighting with a guy, very experienced fire captain that I work with, but he hasn't done a whole lot of this stuff, and I was like, hey, this thing's gonna go quick, and we've got this video. It cracks me up. He was wearing a helmet cam, and I was holding the door, and that room was so volatile that like the smoke pumping all the way around the seams of the door started to light off on me. And I was like, okay, it's time to go. I'm going to boot this thing in, and we're going to bail and let this thing kind of burp out over the top. All the students were all out in the living room. And so it went like living room, bedroom. So we were going to burn, the fire was in one room, is going to burn through the second bedroom and then into the living room. Right.
Right.
So it's all 1403 compliant, all that kind of stuff. But anyways, so I boot the door and I go rocking past him. I'm just out of there because I know how this thing ends. I've been there, done it. And he's like a little bit slower behind me. And on the helmet cam, you just see this like, ball of orange around him. And he just goes, oh, on the helmet cam as he's like bailing out of there. But we got out into the room and we kind of hunkered down. Everybody settled. Like, hey, we're covered by safety lines. We're good. We're not being dangerous. We didn't melt anything. It's just that is a something where somebody who hasn't taught a lot of that live fire in those acquired structures, I would not want somebody who hasn't done that a lot burning that room, right? But I get out there in the living room and we settle down. We're all good. Everybody's all good. We're letting this thing kind of really develop over the top of us. And where I was, there was a side door of the living room that was a little bit of an intake. And so I was kind of in some fresh air. And it was starting to really bank down, get zero vis on us, which is what we were going for. And I could hear the snap and crackle and popping ahead of us. Now, my buddy, Pat, who is on my crew, and Pat's a very experienced live fire instructor, was sitting on the back wall behind me. And he was in charge of the attack line. We always put an instructor right with the nozzleman. That's going to basically, sure, if they get lost or whatever reason, if that instructor needs to grab the nozzle, he's right with them. And Pat's back there and he's like, this is uncomfortable. Like if Jay doesn't call go here soon, I'm going to just say go and send them. And I hear somebody at the back of the room go, it's getting really hot. And I was like, really?
Yeah.
And I'm sitting
like,
here
I'm great where I'm at.
Right. And I didn't realize I was just in this perfect little pocket. But again, trust is just so important, and continuity within the cadre, that each other well, that when I hear Pat pipe up and say, it's getting really hot, I know Pat knows what hot is. And if he's saying it's getting hot, he's basically nudging me, hey, you say go or I'm sending him whether you want it or not.
Yeah.
And even if he did, we've had that happen before where like the attack line just says, we got to go. Now we're going. Like, hey, man, I trust you. If you had to go, I do not. What I don't want is an instructor to sit there and just take this beating and potentially risk hurting somebody or damaging equipment
Right.
because they're afraid to call go because they don't want to be looked down upon. I was in a completely different world, even though we were in the same room. And that can happen in live fire. So that, again, don't let the ego get involved. If you got to do it, just do it. We'll talk about it after.
Yeah. Well, and some people would look like, as I'm listening to your story, some people would look at that situation and be like, well, that's just stupid. That's dangerous. They shouldn't have been doing that. That there shouldn't have been that volume of fire. There shouldn't have been that volume of smoke. And I would challenge anyone who thinks about that and has that opinion to stop for a second. And I want you to imagine that that exact same situation happened in a real fire with people trapped, with students that had never experienced it before.
Yep.
And how do you, and I think that's the biggest takeaway from that story is I would rather have that happen to students 100 times in a training evolution where it's controlled, you have good instructors who know exactly when to call it, than not have it happen until it's real time and it's a real life situation. Because I think that's where we have a lot of people that get hurt unnecessarily because they don't know. They just have never experienced that before. Or they're too afraid to continue on. You know, maybe
Yes.
somebody would have made that hallway had they known the limitations and knew that they had a few more feet to go.
Yeah. And you know, for all the like all the instructors out there, you have to be real with yourself. You have to put your ego aside. The day that you start volunteering to teach anything in the fire service, but especially live fire, is the day that your ego needs to be put to death.
Yeah.
From here on out, like that thing is dead and it is gone and it is buried a long time ago. Because like I don't want everybody teaching that exact scenario. They're like, I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable you know, just through the events that I've and through the mentors that I've had and so on and so forth. Like I'm comfortable doing that. And like a guy like you that's been doing it for a long time, like you're gonna be comfortable doing that. But I don't want it like all of the guys that I teach with, you know, there's guys that I teach with that are phenomenal guys, but like I don't want them lighting that fire and then putting students in there on that in that exact same scenario, right? And it's kind of it's this uncomfortable topic to say because I'm not being like egotistical about it. It's
Yeah.
like, no, man, this is for the students' safety. This is for all of our safety, and so that we can continue to do as a fire service, continue to do realistic live fire training because you're 100% spot on that fire, that zero vis, and we're getting the heat, we're getting all that. Those recruits are going out into a workforce that they will have that fire.
Yeah.
And it's going to happen quickly. And their base reaction, like our recruits' base reaction is, uh, you know, hunt for the intakes, like Scott says, and crush fire. And I want them heavy handed on their water. And their gut reaction is, you know, bail open. Like, hey man, if it's something where, you know, the captain wants to pull them back afterwards and be like, hey, you probably didn't need to put that much water or whatever. Like, cool. We'll have that conversation later.
Yeah.
But when you come out, your base reaction is, you know, boom, I see this, I do this, I know what I'm doing. And so they're trigger pullers, right? They're not indecisive. We're not providing them all these like different avenues of, well, you know, you could do this and here's a tool for your toolbox. Like, no, you see this, you freaking open that bail and you crush it, right? From as far away as you can. And you know, for live fire instructors, if you got to be real with yourself. If you haven't gone outside and tried to learn, and you go to like FDTN and go to, there's a lot of different resources out there. Seek out these people and go and burn with them and take opportunities. Like for me, it was a lot of just seeking these people out and being like, hey, can I just load pallets for you?
Yeah.
Like I'm not asking to teach anything. I just want to show up. I'll load your pallets. I'll change your bottles. I just want to be there to like see how you teach this stuff. And then you start to build that to where you can teach this kind of, I don't want to call it like advanced or whatever, but the fires where stuff can potentially go wrong, not everybody can or should be teaching that. So you
Right.
got to be real with yourself, right? And then do you have the cadre together that is all on the same page? You don't have a bunch of random moving parts. Everybody's one mind. We've talked about it. We've done it. Like, do you have the cadre in place to burn? Because I'm not going to burn the exact same with every single cadre, right? If I'm teaching with, the guys that I burn with at West Coast Training, like we do a lot of putting guys in vendor searching rooms and stuff like that, searching around the fire. Like we do a lot of that stuff, and we'll be burning on floor 2 of an acquired structure. We'll be burning in one room, and we'll have students with a safety line instructor sitting across the room, which is like, that's a risky spot. Now they have a safety line. We cut the window down into a door. Like there's a lot of things that we do to make that 100% safe.
Right. You put in thought. It's not like you just shoved them in a room and said, here you go.
No. And that's why I'm as a part of our group, we have a system designed for that, but I'm not comfortable taking myself and going to burn with like a bunch of random guys and doing that same exact evolution. Right.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think we all have, like I have instructors who I will give them a little bit more leeway. If I'm sitting there and I'm watching a fire condition and I'm like, man, that looks super cheesy. I don't, which my slang is cheesy. Like it looks really bad. Like that's really crappy. So I'm sitting there, I'm watching it, and I'm like, man, but if I know if it's Darren at the end of the hall, I'm probably going to let him ride it a little bit longer than I would Dylan or, anybody else. And so I learned that from some guys down in Oklahoma that I followed around and kind of did that. I'm like, hey man, can I just, clean your bottles and stuff afterwards? Like I'll wash your bunker gear for you. And they're like, all right, whatever, man. But they showed me like, here's the things that you need to have in place. Here's what you need to have in order to make sure that you don't hurt anybody. And a lot of that stuff, ironically, wasn't even NFPA stuff. It's just common sense.
Right. Yeah. And the NFPA interpretations, people will dive into NFPA and like they'll pull out these this has been very illuminating to myself and Ian and stuff as we like started to have, because like some of those videos that you're talking about that we've been able to put out stuff, like we're just trying to basically put out this stuff and like hopefully people are finding it useful and whatnot. And then we'll have some people contact and be like, hey, similar question to this, my training officer isn't super comfortable, blah blah blah, how do we, and just starting to like try to give this advice. One of the things that's very illuminating is how diverse people's interpretations of what we're allowed to do and what we're not, right?
Yes.
And like, man, I'm in Western Washington. This is like one of the most like, hippie, hipster, Greenpeace, like, save the environment. Like I'm in the epicenter of it, and we burn houses constantly. And I'll hear from somebody in like Florida or something like that, or Texas or something, who's like,
Kansas.
we don't ever get to burn. I'm like, what? I thought you guys could like, light a whole tire yard on fire. And but it's how different jurisdictions, different areas interpret it a little bit. And then I think it's a matter of just like educating them, like, no, man, your interpretation a lot of times it is impacted by your bias, which really is you're uncomfortable with the group that we have right now. You're uncomfortable that we're going to hurt somebody. And so you're using your interpretation of 1403 as kind of a scapegoat for what is really happening.
Yeah.
So reaching outside of your area a lot of times is the best way to do it, in my experience. Because my department, we call it asbestos gate. Back in the day, a building they were burning. They unfortunately exposed a bunch of guys to asbestos and stuff, and those guys are all getting chest X-rays all the time. But our city was like, no more, no acquired structure burning. Well, we, through the fire academy, which is like its own separate entity, started burning in acquired structures throughout the county, but not in the city of Everett. Yeah. Well, we showed, hey, we can do this and we can do it safely. And then all of a sudden, this hard no turned into, we'll give you guys one shot. and they gave us we got a building, we pulled it off. It was 4 straight days. It was, you know, a blast. All 4 of our shifts got through it. They had like the local news showed up and put GoPros on people. I mean, they turned it into a thing, but
Yeah.
it was like, hey, this is your shot. Show us you can do it right. And then we showed them, and from now on out, it's been like, yep, you guys are good to go.
Yeah.
So
So, and along those same lines, we had, one of the departments that I volunteer with, we did not have a burn training facility. I mean, it just wasn't there. And so we had a long discussion. We talked about it. We had a guy on the department that was, he did construction. He was a roofer. And he goes, well, I could build a box. And I'm like, man. So I called around to people that I know, and I'm like, hey, is this stupid? Like, does this qualify? Can we do this? And they're like, yeah, it's a burn prop. I'm like, no, 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 no. I don't think you heard me. It's a burn building. They're like, no, it's a burn prop. I'm like, okay. They're like, if it's a burn prop, it doesn't have to follow NFPA 1403 or 1401 and, you know, all this other stuff. And so you still have to follow 1403, obviously. But
right.
we built this thing. It's like 35 by 35 feet. It's got 2 rooms, including a burn room that's all sheeted and everything. It's got 2 hallways, multiple entries, multiple windows. This thing has survived probably a dozen and a half live burns and a tornado. And still, like, seriously, the Linwood tornadoes that came through Kansas like a couple years ago were like a couple miles north of where this burn box is. So I'm thinking this thing's going to be gone. And we pull up afterwards, like 2 days afterwards, I finally made it over there. And
we don't have in the PNW. That was funny to me.
yeah. I mean, I looked over and I was like, oh my God, that thing is still here. Like it stayed, you know? And
That's
so,
awesome.
yeah. And so I think a lot of times people are so worried about, you know, violating NFPA. And I think they look at it like I'm running around with an automatic weapon that I never got my, you know, my federal tax stamp for. And it's like, dude, that's not how this works. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how many people have reached out. Have you ever reached out to NFPA for any kind of explanation of something or further?
You know, not, I haven't directly. So Ian is, I'm pretty sure he just got on one of the committees for 1403. But he's heading down that path, because really there just needs to be like some more clarity there, you know, and not like, I understand why they're broad, because you don't want these like very hyper specific thing, you know, where it's very restrictive. You don't want that, but you kind of want a system where you just want a clear, more safe, a system that's clear picture of how safety is going to be achieved while also achieving realistic live fire. Like
Yeah.
that's what you want. And right now it's very up in the air. And like I said, I think more often than not, it's people's, it's just, you know, training officer, they're like using it as a scapegoat, 1403 and you know, live fire NFPAs for just their uncomfort.
Sure.
But you know, reaching outside of the area to find places like FDTN, I think, is a phenomenal resource. Like Jim, I've called him up before and been like, hey, how are you guys doing this so that it meets, like, basement fires is one, because in NFPA it talks about how you can't, you know, put people in unidirectional exhaust and so on and so forth. And like there's ways that you can do it, meet the NFPA standard, and still your brain is not like comprehending it, right? Which is, you call a guy like Jim and you're like, hey, how do you guys do this? And you know, okay, boom, 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 and here's how we, you know, meet this standard while still maintaining this. And we're, you know, all these things that you would just you're not even remotely able to think about in your own little bubble. And then you talk to a guy like that, you're like, boom, got it. And then you bring it back and you're able to pull it off. So I think that is the key, is reaching out to people who are, you know, like yourself and who are doing this stuff safely, following NFPA, and have little, you know, tips and tricks and tweaks and stuff to be able to provide both of those safety and realism components.
Yeah. And those who don't know Jim McCormack and the FDTN system as a whole, and I call it a system because that's really what it is. I mean, it is its own little world.
Right.
I got to go out there and spend some time with him when I was in Indianapolis a couple years ago. And you're right. I mean, there are people that look at videos and look at what they do at FDTN and they're like, oh man, that's so unsafe. But if you talk to Jim and all of his cadre, they are so safety oriented and they're so on top of making sure that things are done in accordance with the rules. And so I constantly am like, oh yeah, you don't think that we can do that? Well, go look over here or watch
Yeah,
this video of FDTN or talk to
right.
this guy because they've been doing it for years and, knock on wood, it's worked.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Just reach outside your own, outside your little bubble. And, like acquired structure stuff will have people every once in a while reach out and be like, hey, we can't, our area, there's no way, it's a no-go, and blah 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 blah. And what it is, they think it's a no-go. And you know how the fire department and the fire service works is like the telephone game. Like, one guy gets told, oh, that'll never happen here, and it's from a guy that you respect, and you're just like, oh, okay, it'll never happen here. Yep. And everybody just kind of settles for it. That happened to me at my department. It was asbestos gate, that's never happened here, blah blah blah. Like, well, are you sure about that? Like, and so I'm proof personally that that's not always the case. I'm not going to say it's going to work out every time, but I think more often than not, by reaching outside and trying to pull in some of the knowledge from other areas that's out there, you end up knocking down some of these barriers and like, go find out for yourself. Talk to the
Sure.
uppers yourself instead of relying on the fire service telephone game to pass your information. Go talk to them like, hey, why can't we do this here? Like, these guys over here in Western Washington, where it's nuts, the stuff they make. Like, I built our house, and to build a house out here, even in the middle of the woods like we are, the environmental stuff that they want you to consider in Western Washington is just asinine. It's like, have you considered the impact on the oil and the beaver for 3 counties away, right?
Gosh.
So, but like, we can do it, and there's a bunch of reasons why we're allowed to, why the environmental, the EPA and all that kind of stuff lets us do our thing. And then, yeah, man, you can probably do it in Kansas. Yeah. It's just a matter of, meeting these concerns that they have and addressing them. And once you address their concerns, they're like, okay, yeah, no, yeah, you guys are good to burn.
Oh, yeah. Well, and even in the state of Kansas, and I can't speak for anywhere else, but we had a situation that was kind of similar. Very, very, very strict. You have to have the asbestos abatement and all that. And then you have to remove 75% of the roofing material, and you can only have so much area. And so when I was talking to the KDHE, or Kansas Department of Health and Environmental Services, he goes, well, yeah, you can do all that, but why don't you just burn room to room? And I go, okay, what does that matter? And he goes, well, if you burn room to room, you don't have to do all that. And I go, really? He goes, yeah, no. He said, if you're not getting into the structural members of the house, if you're just burning in those rooms and everything's going to remain intact, you don't have to do any of that stuff. Now, if you're going to burn that house all the way to the ground, then yes,
right. That's different.
We need to have the roof shingles taken off. And I was like, okay. He goes, now I'm just going to tell you, if it gets away from you and we get a phone call, you're going to have to do some explaining, And so he's like, I don't want you to get that idea that you can just, oops, we let it go too far and the whole building burned down.
Yep.
But we did, and we went and we burned, and it was great. It was a great time. We didn't have to spend 2 weeks prepping the building and trying to do all this stuff to get it ready. We did the asbestos test. It came back negative. We burned. That was it. And so,
last week, our building, for instance, it had an addition, and the addition had asbestos in the floor. And so we just basically kind of triage it and say, should we like take the time to tear all this stuff out, or should we just wall it off and say, forget about that side?
Don't go this far. Yep.
Right. But then you run the risk of, hey, if it gets away from you, that, right. So he's absolutely right. And we just kind of triage it. We're like, hey, let's just write that side off. Let's not mess around with asbestos. That side's done. We're not doing a complete, we just told the building owner, we can't do a complete burn down of this place. I'm sorry. But thanks and they're usually, they understand, the pro to doing acquired structure burns in the first place, like we have a relationship with our building department where anytime somebody files for a demo, they get asked, hey, do you want to donate it to the fire department? It'll save you on haul and material. They can do a complete burn down. There's a lot of benefits for them. It's actually cheap for them to go with us.
Yeah.
So it's appealing for them. They don't have to like knock down and haul material away and pay for all that, which is massively expensive. But in that case, it's like, hey man, we can't come through on the full burn down because of this, but thank you for letting us do the training anyway. And the guy was stoked that we were able to do it. But we just wrote it off. We burned in what we could, and it was room to room. And then when we're done for the day, we're not messing around with like we're not prepping for burn down. So we're doing massive overhauls. So the recruits got a lot of experience doing overhaul on a real building. So
dude, I love that. I love that. So how can people get a hold of you? Like where can people go to see your videos? Where can people go to get a hold of you if they have questions?
So I'm on Facebook. That's pretty much all I'm on. But you can look up West Coast Fire Training on I think they got a YouTube. Ian's got the YouTube channel up there now, and reach out through West Coast Fire Training's Facebook page. So yeah, that's kind of where we're doing all of our live fire stuff through, but yeah, you can hit me up directly on Facebook, or I'm always up for preferably if you want to talk about this stuff, it's preferably a phone call. I'm not a good texter, so
I get it.
Yeah.
Well, so anybody that is like Tim that's having the same issues, I would definitely say reach out to people like Jay. You're a huge resource. Like I said, I love watching your videos. It's not just in the bathroom when I'm watching them, but there's
however it gets in, man.
Dude, there are so many times where I'm watching your videos or videos like yours, and there's just so much to be learned by it. So I love what you're doing. I love what you and the West Coast guys are doing. Keep it up for sure. And I really do appreciate you taking time to answer the question. And like I said, if anybody has any questions, you can always send them his way. Check him out on Facebook and Instagram. So until the next time we talk, take care, be safe, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Jay, thanks again for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it. It was a blast.